The woman's trembling hands reached for her son's face, her voice breaking as she whispered those 3 words that would shatter everything he thought he knew about coming home. "Who are you?" Maria Petrov asked the man in uniform standing at her doorstep, the man wearing her son's face but carrying a stranger's eyes, and in that moment, neither of them knew that the secret she'd been guarding for an entire year would either destroy them both or save the only thing that truly mattered, the truth about what really happened to Sergeant Alexei Petrov in the frozen trenches outside Bakhmut. Maria Petrov had spent 30 years cleaning the marble floors of the Donovan International law firm in downtown Chicago, her knees bearing the weight of countless hours spent ensuring every surface gleamed with perfection. At 52, her hands bore the calluses of honest work, but her mind held something far more valuable, a photographic memory that had allowed her to absorb every conversation, every document left carelessly on desks, every whispered secret in the hallways she cleaned late into the night. She lived in a modest apartment in Little Village with memories of her husband Victor, who had passed 3 years ago from cancer, and the constant worry for her only son Alexei, who had volunteered to fight in Ukraine despite having American citizenship, driven by a desire to defend the homeland his parents had fled decades ago. What none of her employers knew was that Maria spoke 7 languages fluently, a gift from her grandmother who had been a translator in Soviet-era Moscow, and that she had quietly been taking online law courses for the past decade, memorizing every precedent, every statute, every legal maneuver she observed in the firm where she was invisible to everyone except the other night staff. The Donovan firm represented some of the most powerful clients in the military-industrial complex, and among them was Marcus Hammond, a defense contractor who had built his empire on the backs of wars he'd never fought, profiting from conflicts he watched from the safety of his Lake Shore Drive penthouse. Hammond was a man who wore $1,000 shoes and treated everyone beneath his tax bracket as furniture, necessary but unworthy of acknowledgement. He had a particular disdain for the cleaning staff, often leaving degrading notes about their work and ensuring their Christmas bonuses were cut for the slightest perceived infractions. His secretary, Jennifer, had once overheard him saying that immigrants like Maria were lucky to even have jobs in America, that they should be grateful for whatever scraps they received. But Hammond's cruelty was matched only by his carelessness, leaving sensitive documents on his desk, conducting phone calls about illegal arms deals while Maria quietly mopped nearby, never suspecting that the invisible woman understood every word of his conversations in English, Russian, and Ukrainian. Then there was James Donovan himself, the founding partner of the firm, a man who had built his reputation defending corporations against war crimes allegations and ensuring that those who profited from human suffering never faced justice. At 68, Donovan had everything: wealth, power, respect, except the one thing money couldn't buy: redemption for the son he'd lost in Afghanistan 15 years ago, a loss that had turned him from an idealistic young lawyer into a cynical machine of legal destruction. He moved through life like a ghost haunting his own existence, working 18-hour days to avoid going home to an empty mansion where his ex-wife's absence still echoed in every room. Donovan had noticed Maria over the years, the way she worked with quiet dignity, the way she never complained despite the firm's treatment of her, but he'd never spoken to her beyond an occasional nod, trapped in the prison of his own grief and the walls he'd built around his heart. The knock had come on a Tuesday evening in March, just as Maria was preparing her simple dinner of vareniki and borscht, the same meal she'd made every Tuesday since Victor died, a ritual that kept his memory alive in the steam rising from the pot. When she opened the door and saw the figure in the Ukrainian military uniform, her heart had stopped for a moment that stretched into eternity, but then she saw his face, Alexei's face, the same strong jaw, the same dark hair, though now with streaks of premature gray. But when she looked into his eyes, something fundamental was wrong, something that made her maternal instincts scream in alarm. These were not her son's eyes, not the warm brown eyes that had looked up at her with love for 28 years, but cold, calculating eyes that belonged to a stranger. The man smiled, but it was practiced, rehearsed, lacking the crooked authenticity of Alexei's genuine joy. He stepped forward to embrace her, and the words escaped her lips before she could stop them, a primal recognition that this was not her child. The man who claimed to be Alexei froze at her words, his smile faltering for just a moment before he recovered, launching into a story about trauma, about how war changes people, about how the things he'd seen and done had transformed him into someone different. He knew details about their life, Victor's death, the apartment, even the name of their old cat Pushkin who had died when Alexei was 12. But Maria's memory, that perfect recall that had been both gift and curse, could not reconcile the person before her with the son she'd raised. She noticed how he held his fork differently, how his Ukrainian had a slight accent that hadn't been there before, how he didn't remember the lullaby she'd sung to him every night until he was 10. The terror grew in her chest as she realized that someone was wearing her son's face, speaking with his voice, but it was not him. Yet she said nothing more that night, playing along with the charade while her mind raced. Because if this wasn't Alexei, then where was her real son, and why was this imposter in her home? Days turned into weeks as Maria maintained the pretense, serving breakfast to the stranger who slept in Alexei's room, washing clothes that smelled wrong, listening to stories about battles that felt rehearsed rather than remembered. She began her own investigation, using the skills she'd learned from 3 decades of being invisible, following the imposter when he left the apartment, noting the calls he made in English to numbers she memorized, observing how he seemed to be photographing documents in Alexei's room and sending them somewhere. Her suspicions crystallized when she overheard him speaking on the phone in perfect, unaccented English. Her Alexei had always struggled with certain pronunciations, a source of teenage frustration that no amount of practice could fix. But it was the moment she saw him typing on Alexei's laptop with both hands, fluid and fast, that she knew for certain. Her son had lost his left pinky finger in a childhood accident, had never been able to type properly, a disability this man clearly didn't share. Subscribe to our channel for more heart-wrenching stories of truth and justice, where ordinary people face extraordinary circumstances and emerge victorious through courage and love. The revelation sent Maria into a spiral of grief and determination that consumed her days and haunted her nights. She couldn't go to the police. Who would believe a cleaning lady's claims that her son had been replaced by an imposter? The man had military documents, DNA tests could be faked or substituted, and she had no proof except a mother's instinct and observations that would be dismissed as trauma or delusion. But Maria had spent 30 years in the shadows of power, learning how the system worked, understanding that justice was not given but taken by those brave enough to seize it. She began recording the imposter's conversations, using the phone Victor had left behind, documenting every inconsistency, every slip of the mask. She followed him to meetings with men in expensive suits, recognized some of them from the Donovan firm, including Marcus Hammond himself, and slowly, the pieces of a conspiracy began to form in her mind. The truth, when she uncovered it, was more horrifying than she could have imagined. Through fragments of overheard conversations and documents she photographed during her cleaning shifts, Maria discovered that Hammond had been running an illegal operation, selling military intelligence from Ukrainian forces to the highest bidder, using soldiers' identities to smuggle information out of the war zone. Her real son had discovered the operation and threatened to expose it, so Hammond had him killed, replacing him with a professional operative who would return to America under Alexei's identity to retrieve additional intelligence Alexei had hidden before his death. The imposter's mission was to find and destroy evidence Alexei had compiled about Hammond's treason, evidence that could send dozens of powerful people to prison. Maria's blood ran cold when she realized that once the imposter found what he was looking for, she would be eliminated as a loose end, another casualty in Hammond's war for profit. The crisis deepened when Maria discovered that Alexei had indeed hidden something before his death, a flash drive containing recordings, documents, and proof of Hammond's entire operation, hidden in a place only she would know to look, inside the music box Victor had given her on their wedding day, the one that played the lullaby she'd sung to Alexei as a child. The imposter had been searching for weeks, growing increasingly frustrated and dangerous, his facade cracking as pressure mounted from his handlers. Maria knew she was running out of time when she overheard him on the phone saying that if he couldn't find the evidence soon, they would have to clean up the situation, a euphemism she understood all too well. She had the power to expose everything, but doing so would mean admitting her son was dead, a truth she wasn't ready to face, and putting herself directly in the crosshairs of men who had killed before and would kill again. The breaking point came when the imposter, desperate and running out of patience, dropped all pretense one evening, grabbing Maria's wrist hard enough to leave bruises and demanding to know where Alexei would have hidden the package. His mask had finally slipped completely, revealing the cold killer beneath, and Maria realized she had perhaps hours, not days, before they decided she was more liability than asset. In that moment of terror and clarity, she made a decision that would have made her real son proud. She would not just survive, but she would ensure that Alexei's sacrifice meant something. She contacted the only person she knew who had both the power and the potential conscience to help her, James Donovan, leaving a cryptic message with his secretary that she had information about his firm's biggest client that could destroy them all. Donovan almost dismissed the message, as he did with most attempts at whistleblowing, but something about Maria's name nagged at him, a recognition that this was the woman who had cleaned his office for 3 decades without complaint, who had been there the night he'd broken down crying on the anniversary of his son's death, who had left a simple note of condolence and a homemade meal on his desk without ever mentioning it again. Curiosity, or perhaps the first stirring of conscience in years, led him to agree to meet her at a small cafe in Little Village, far from the firm's prying eyes. When Maria walked in, he was struck by the steel in her spine, the intelligence in her eyes that he'd somehow never noticed before, and when she began to speak, laying out the conspiracy with the precision of a seasoned prosecutor. He felt the foundations of his carefully constructed world begin to crack. She showed him the evidence from the flash drive, played recordings of Hammond discussing the murder of American soldiers, and Donovan saw in Alexei's sacrifice a mirror of his own son's death, another young man destroyed by the machinery of war profiteering he'd spent 15 years protecting. The conversation that followed was unlike anything Donovan had experienced in his professional life, not a negotiation or a legal strategy session, but a raw, human moment of reckoning. Maria spoke of her son with a love that transcended death, of the boy who had volunteered to fight not for glory, but because he believed in protecting innocence, of the man who had chosen justice over his own life. She didn't beg or plead but simply presented the truth and asked Donovan a question that cut through all his defenses. How many more mothers have to lose their sons so men like Hammond can buy another yacht? In her grief and determination, Donovan saw a reflection of what he could have been, should have been, after his own loss, someone who fought against the machine rather than becoming part of it. The meeting ended with Donovan taking the evidence, not sure what he would do with it, but knowing that something fundamental had changed in him, awakening of the idealism he'd buried with his son. Click the like button if you believe that truth and justice should prevail, no matter how powerful the opposition might be. The next 72 hours were a masterclass in legal and strategic maneuvering as Donovan, working with Maria, orchestrated a trap that would expose not just Hammond but the entire network of corruption. Using his position and reputation, Donovan arranged a meeting at the firm under the pretense of finalizing a major defense contract, inviting Hammond, the imposter posing as Alexei, and several other conspirators. What they didn't know was that Donovan had already contacted federal prosecutors, military intelligence, and journalists, providing them with enough evidence to secure warrants and surveillance. Maria's role was crucial. She would confront the imposter in front of everyone, using her knowledge of her real son to expose the deception in a way that no one could deny or explain away. The stage was set for a confrontation that would either bring justice or see them both destroyed. The meeting took place in the firm's main conference room, the same room where Maria had spent countless nights cleaning, absorbing the secrets that would now be turned against those who had dismissed her as insignificant. She entered not as the cleaning lady but as a mother seeking justice, wearing her best dress, the one she'd saved for Alexei's wedding that would never come. The imposter's face went pale when he saw her, realizing too late that this was a trap. Hammond started to object, but Donovan cut him off, announcing that they had a special guest who had something important to share. Maria stood before the assembled group of powerful men and began to speak, her voice steady despite the earthquakes in her chest, describing intimate details about her son that no imposter could know. The scar on his knee from when he fell off his bike at age 7, the way he couldn't pronounce the word refrigerator until he was 12, the poem he'd written for Victor's funeral that no one else had ever read. With each word, Maria dismantled the imposter's identity, but the true revelation came when she produced the flash drive and played a video Alexei had recorded before his death, insurance against the conspiracy he'd uncovered. In the video, her real son, thin and exhausted but with those warm brown eyes she knew so well, detailed Hammond's operations, named names, provided coordinates and dates, and ended with a message to his mother in Ukrainian, using the pet name only they shared, telling her he loved her and asking her to be strong. The room erupted in chaos as Hammond tried to flee, the imposter reached for a weapon, and federal agents stormed in, having heard everything through the wires Donovan was wearing. In the melee, Maria stood perfectly still, tears streaming down her face as she watched justice beginning to turn its slow but inexorable wheels. The climax reached its peak when the imposter, cornered and desperate, pulled out a gun and pointed it at Maria, screaming that she had ruined everything, that she was just a nobody, a cleaning lady who should have kept her mouth shut. But Maria didn't flinch, looking him straight in the eye and saying in perfect Ukrainian, "You might wear his face, but you could never have his heart. My son died a hero, and you will be forgotten as a coward." The standoff lasted only seconds before Donovan, in an act of courage that surprised even himself, stepped between Maria and the gun, stating simply, "Not another mother. Never again." The imposter hesitated just long enough for the federal agents to take him down, and as he was dragged away, still wearing Alexei's face but stripped of all pretense, Maria allowed herself to finally grieve for the son she'd lost and celebrate the justice he'd achieved from beyond the grave. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of arrests, with Hammond and 17 other conspirators taken into custody on charges ranging from treason to murder, their network of corruption unraveling like a cheap suit in the rain. The imposter, whose real name was revealed to be David Carlson, a former CIA operative gone rogue, provided testimony in exchange for a reduced sentence, confirming that Alexei had been killed after refusing to participate in the intelligence selling scheme and threatening to expose it. The real Alexei's body was recovered from a mass grave outside Bakhmut and brought home for a proper burial with full military honors, the funeral attended by hundreds who had learned of his sacrifice. Maria stood at the graveside, finally able to say goodbye properly, surrounded not by emptiness but by a community that had rallied around her, recognizing the courage it had taken to expose the truth. Donovan's transformation was perhaps the most profound of all. The man who had spent 15 years defending the indefensible found himself on the other side of the courtroom, serving as a witness for the prosecution against his own former clients. He disbanded his practice at the firm, using his considerable wealth to establish a foundation in his son's name that provided legal services to military families and whistleblowers. But more importantly, he found in Maria an unexpected friendship that filled the hollow spaces in his life. They would meet weekly for coffee, two parents bound by loss but also by the choice to honor their children's memories through action rather than despair. Donovan would often say that Maria had saved not just justice but his soul, showing him that it was never too late to choose the right side. Share your thoughts in the comments about the courage it takes to stand up against powerful forces when you have everything to lose. The resolution of Maria's story became legendary in certain circles, a testament to the power of one person's determination to find truth in a world built on lies. She was offered substantial compensation from the government for her role in exposing the conspiracy, money that she used to establish a scholarship fund in Alexei's name for children of immigrants who wanted to serve their country. She continued working at a law firm, but now as a paralegal at a practice specializing in human rights cases, her photographic memory and linguistic skills finally recognized and valued. The firm was run by young lawyers who had been inspired by her story, who saw in her not just a survivor but a symbol of how justice could prevail when good people refused to stay silent. Maria kept Alexei's room exactly as it had been, not as a shrine to grief but as a reminder of the love that had given her strength to face down killers and conspirators. She would sometimes sit on his bed, holding the music box that had hidden the evidence, listening to the lullaby that connected 3 generations of her family. On the first anniversary of exposing the conspiracy, she received a package with no return address. Inside was Alexei's Ukrainian military medal, the one he'd been awarded posthumously, along with a note from a soldier who had served with him. The note simply said, "Your son saved my life twice, once in battle when he pulled me from a burning vehicle, and again after death when his evidence exposed those who would have sent more of us to die for profit. A mother's love conquered an empire of evil. Thank you." The story of Maria Petrov became required reading at several military academies and law schools, a case study in how institutional power could be challenged by individual courage. Documents released years later revealed that Alexei's investigation had uncovered not just Hammond's operation but a network of similar schemes across multiple conflicts, leading to reforms in military contractor oversight that saved countless lives. Maria would occasionally speak at events, always beginning with the same words, "I am just a mother who loved her son and remembered everything." She would talk about the importance of seeing the invisible people, the cleaners and drivers and service workers who moved through the halls of power absorbing secrets, possessing skills and knowledge that were dismissed because of their stations in life. James Donovan lived another 10 years after the conspiracy was exposed, years he described as the only meaningful ones since his son's death. He and Maria developed a deep friendship that transcended their different backgrounds, united by their shared loss and their choice to transform grief into purpose. When he was diagnosed with terminal cancer, Maria was there every day, bringing the same vareniki and borscht she'd once made for her family, sitting with him as he faced his final journey. In his will, he left the majority of his estate to the foundation they had built together, ensuring that their children's sacrifices would continue to inspire justice long after they were gone. At his funeral, Maria spoke of redemption, of how a man who had lost his way had found it again through choosing courage over comfort, truth over profit. The ripple effects of Maria's courage continued for years, inspiring other whistleblowers to come forward, other invisible people to speak up, other mothers to demand justice for their children. Laws were changed, conspirators were imprisoned, and systems of accountability were put in place that made it harder for war profiteers to operate in the shadows. But perhaps the most important change was in how people saw those they had previously overlooked: the cleaning staff, the service workers, the immigrants who formed the backbone of society while being treated as invisible. Maria's story reminded the world that everyone had dignity, everyone had worth, and everyone had the potential to change the world if they had the courage to stand up for what was right. 5 years after Alexei's death, Maria stood at his grave on a cold March morning, similar to the day the imposter had knocked on her door. But now she wasn't alone. She was surrounded by other mothers who had lost children to war and corruption, women who had found strength in her example. They called themselves Alexei's mothers, and they worked tirelessly to ensure that no soldier's sacrifice would be exploited for profit, that no mother would have to face what Maria had faced alone. As she placed fresh flowers on the headstone, Maria spoke to her son as she always did, telling him about the lives saved because of his courage, the justice achieved through his sacrifice, the love that had transcended death itself. The morning sun broke through the clouds as Maria finished her visit, illuminating the rows of white headstones that stretched across the cemetery, each one representing a story, a sacrifice, a family's grief and pride. She walked slowly back to her car, where Donovan's daughter was waiting to drive her home. The young woman had become like a granddaughter to Maria, finding in her the maternal love she'd lost when her parents divorced. As they drove through the streets of Chicago, Maria reflected on the journey from that terrible night when she'd recognized that the man at her door was not her son, through the darkness of conspiracy and danger, to this moment of peace and purpose. She had lost everything and gained something she never expected, a legacy of justice that would outlive them all. In her apartment, Maria continued her work, now as a consultant for intelligence agencies, helping them identify imposter operations and protect military families from exploitation. Her photographic memory had become a weapon for justice, her linguistic skills a bridge between communities, her courage an inspiration to those who felt powerless. She had transformed from an invisible cleaning lady into a force for change, but she remained, at her core, simply a mother who had loved her son enough to risk everything for the truth. The photographs of Alexei that lined her walls showed him at every age, the baby who had gripped her finger with surprising strength, the boy who had skinned his knees learning to ride a bike, the young man who had hugged her goodbye before leaving for Ukraine, never knowing it would be their last embrace. The story of Maria and Alexei Petrov became more than just a tale of conspiracy exposed. It became a testament to the power of maternal love, the importance of remembering the forgotten, and the courage required to speak truth to power. Universities studied it, filmmakers documented it, and most importantly, policies were changed because of it. The Alexei Petrov Act, passed 3 years after his death, provided protections for military whistleblowers and their families, ensuring that no soldier would have to choose between their conscience and their life. Maria attended the signing ceremony, standing next to the president as the bill became law, wearing the same simple dress she'd worn the day she confronted her son's killers, a reminder that heroes didn't always wear capes or uniforms, sometimes they wore cleaning gloves and carried mops. As the years passed, Maria aged gracefully, her hair turning silver, her steps growing slower, but her mind remaining sharp as ever. She never remarried, dedicating her life to preserving Alexei's memory and fighting for others who had no voice. She learned to use computers, to navigate social media, to reach new generations with her message of courage and justice. Young people would seek her out, wanting to understand how one woman had brought down a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of power, and she would always tell them the same thing: I remembered everything, I loved my son, and I refused to be invisible anymore. Her apartment became a gathering place for activists, whistleblowers, and families seeking justice, all drawn to the quiet strength of a woman who had faced down death and chosen truth. The final chapter of Maria's public story came when she was invited to speak at the United Nations on the International Day of Peace, sharing her experience with representatives from around the world. She stood at the podium, this woman who had once cleaned floors in silence, and spoke with the authority of someone who had earned the right to be heard. She talked about the cost of war, not just in lives lost but in the corruption it bred, the profiteering it enabled, the families it destroyed. She spoke of Alexei not as a victim but as a hero who had chosen justice over safety, truth over silence. And she challenged the assembled diplomats and leaders to remember the invisible people in their own countries, the ones who saw everything and said nothing because no one would listen. Her speech received a standing ovation, but more importantly, it led to international protocols for protecting military whistleblowers and their families. In her final years, Maria found an unexpected peace, knowing that she had transformed her grief into something meaningful, that Alexei's death had not been in vain. She would sit in her small garden, the one she'd planted with seeds from Ukraine, and tell stories to the neighborhood children about bravery and justice, about the importance of remembering and the power of truth. She never stopped missing Alexei, never stopped talking to him in the quiet moments, but the sharp edge of grief had been worn smooth by purpose and the knowledge that his legacy lived on in every life saved by the reforms his sacrifice had inspired. When journalists would ask her if she had any regrets, she would smile sadly and say, "Only that I couldn't save him. But he saved so many others, and that has to be enough." Maria Petrov passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78, 15 years after that night when she'd looked into a stranger's eyes and known her son was gone. Her funeral was attended by hundreds, military families, journalists, lawyers, government officials, and ordinary people whose lives had been touched by her courage. James Donovan's daughter delivered the eulogy, speaking of a woman who had shown that love was stronger than fear, that truth was more powerful than lies, and that one person's courage could change the world. As they lowered her casket into the ground next to Alexei's, a military honor guard played the Ukrainian national anthem, followed by the American one, recognizing her as a hero of both nations. The headstone read simply, Maria Petrov, Mother, Hero, Truth-teller. She remembered everything. The legacy of Maria and Alexei Petrov lives on in the foundation that bears their names, in the laws that protect whistleblowers, in the families who found justice because of their sacrifice. Every year on the anniversary of Alexei's death, people gather at their graves to remember not just how they died but how they lived, with courage, with purpose, with an unshakable belief that truth would prevail. The story is taught in schools as an example of how ordinary people can do extraordinary things when faced with injustice. Maria's apartment was turned into a small museum, preserving her story for future generations, with a music box that had hidden the evidence displayed prominently, still playing the lullaby she had sung to her son. Visitors would leave flowers and notes, thanking a woman they'd never met for showing them that everyone had the power to change the world. The conspiracy that had killed Alexei was completely dismantled, with over 50 people eventually convicted and imprisoned, their network of corruption exposed and destroyed. The reforms implemented because of Maria's courage saved countless lives and prevented untold suffering. Military contractors were subjected to unprecedented oversight, soldiers were given protected channels to report wrongdoing, and families were guaranteed support if their loved ones were killed for exposing corruption. The intelligence community implemented the Petrov Protocols, named in honor of both mother and son, establishing procedures to prevent imposter operations and protect military families from exploitation. These changes rippled across the world, inspiring similar reforms in other nations and creating a global network of protection for those who chose conscience over complicity. In the end, the story of the mother who asked, "Who are you?" to the man wearing her son's face became a legend of love conquering fear, of truth defeating lies, of justice prevailing against impossible odds. Maria Petrov, the invisible cleaning lady who spoke 7 languages and remembered everything, had brought down an empire of corruption through the simple act of refusing to accept a lie, even when that lie wore the face of everything she loved. Her courage reminded the world that heroes came in all forms, that strength wasn't always loud or violent, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice was a mother's love combined with an unwillingness to remain silent. The secret she had kept for a year, that her son was dead and an imposter had taken his place, became the key to unlocking a conspiracy that might have continued claiming lives for decades. As the sun sets on this story of sacrifice and triumph, we're reminded that evil flourishes when good people remain silent, but it crumbles when even one person finds the courage to speak truth to power. Maria Petrov was that person, transforming from a woman who was overlooked and dismissed into a force that toppled giants and inspired millions. Her story teaches us that everyone has the potential for heroism, that love is the most powerful motivator for justice, and that remembering, truly remembering, those we've lost means fighting to ensure their deaths have meaning. In a world that often seems dominated by corruption and cruelty, Maria's victory reminds us that integrity and courage, combined with intelligence and determination, can still triumph over evil. Thank you for joining us for this powerful story of a mother's love and the pursuit of justice. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments below about the courage it takes to stand up against impossible odds. Remember, every one of us has the power to make a difference, to refuse to be invisible, to demand justice even when it seems impossible. Until next time, remember that truth has a way of surfacing, justice has a way of prevailing, and love, especially a mother's love, has the power to change the world.